All right, now in this section, let's take a bunch of the concepts of the things that we've learned already and sort of try and combine them into a nice little fun mini project that we can render. First, going to do it in Render in Mantra, which is the renderer that comes with Houdini, and then we're going to modify the setup for Redshift. So I'm assuming this isn't going to be the most in-depth dive into rendering we've ever seen. We're not going to cover absolutely every parameter or anything like that. It's just going to be a general overview so that you can sort of get an idea of how to export image sequences from Houdini directly. Also regarding Redshift, the Redshift node is very similar to how it would be set up in another application. It's just because it is a node now and it's in the Houdini interface, it might be a little bit confusing or daunting at first to kind of get around and find all the parameters that you're familiar with. So what we're going to do is we're going to just first start off by creating some geometry that we want to render. So here I am in my build desktop in a fresh new scene. I'm going to hit the D key. We're going to turn the background dark. And I'm going to also turn off the origin gnomon again. So we're left with this. And the first thing I'm going to do is throw down a blank geo. So I'm going to hit tab, type geo. And we've got our geometry node. So let's dive inside that. The first thing we need is a platonic solid. So let's do platonic solid. I'm going to choose, we've got different options here, cube, octahedron. I'm going to choose the dodecahedron for our example here. And let's throw down a polywire. Polywire is a fun node that basically just creates a wireframe geometry out of whatever you input into it. And you've got all sorts of parameters here, like the number of divisions around each oh, it's asking me to save my project because I have my autosave turned on, so let's do that. I'm going to navigate to, let's see, my lesson files. We're going to go on lesson 02E. This is going to be lesson 02E rendering version 2. All right. And while I'm here, I'm going to go and set my job variable to be where my hip variable is. So I'm just going to grab this, copy, go down to, and it looks like it's actually already on my job variable, but this will come in handy later when we're rendering and stuff like that. So we've got those set up. All right, back to this. Polywire. We can change the number of divisions around each wire, and we can also change the number of segments it divides within each wire. So we'll just set this as something like 4 and 6 for right now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide it. So sort on a subdivide like so. And I'm just going to crank this up to something like, 3. So we get some nice smooth geometry there. And let's see, what I'm going to do beforehand is I'm actually going to smooth this out using a smooth node. So let's drop a smooth node right in between. I'm actually just going to highlight the smooth node for right now and kind of dial in some of these settings. I think that maybe I go lower divisions on this and fewer segments, so we start to get something that looks a little bit more organic. Maybe I'll increase the radius on this. Actually, I think I might want to increase the number of segments here. You can see it's starting to get a more of an atomic look to it. Let's increase this. Let's turn the subdivide back on while we do this, so we can kind of see how this is changing our shape. It's kind of fun. I'm gonna go with, let's see. Let's increase this. Let's decrease these segments. Something like that looks pretty good to me. Looks like I got 4 divisions, 3 segments, and a wire radius of around 0.25. So let's put that in there like so. Cool. We can adjust all this stuff later. I'm just going to bring this out a little bit and bring this up a little bit. Okay, cool. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw down a copy. So let's type copy, and when I type that down, there's a few options. I'm just choosing this copy and transform. So literally the first option, hit enter and throw it down on your network like that. I'm going to wire this in, and it says right here that we have 2 copies so far. I'm going to crank this up. You can see that nothing much is happening because we've not applied any transforms to our copies. So what I want to do here is I want to actually just scale all of our copies up slightly. So I'm going to just drag this slider, and you can see that all of our copies, every time it makes a copy, it's just increasing its scale by, you know, some uniform amount as such. So let's set that to something like 1.1. So we've got our copies here. I'm going to just decrease the total number of copies at the moment to like something like 9. So yeah, each time it makes a copy, it just increases its scale slightly. So that's cool. The next thing I'm going to do is I just want to slightly rotate each copy as well. So I'm going to middle mouse click here, and I'm going to drag the ladder to maybe something like -5 in the X, and then let's do something like +5 in the Y, maybe positive, yeah, let's do +8 in the Y, and then let's do +5 in the Z direction. Cool. So we've got this sort of like tunnel appearing. Actually, I'm going to decrease this one slightly as well, and maybe just decrease this one a little bit. Something like that, yeah. So we've got sort of almost like these little tunnels that are emanating from the middle of our geometry. Awesome. So now we don't actually have any animation on this. Let's try and add a transform in a nice spot here. So let's just throw down a transform. And if I throw down a transform right here, and in the rotate channel, I just type @frame, which is just going to grab whatever frame we're on and rotate it in X by that, we get this pretty generic motion. It's just taking what we had and rotating it. But if I was to go and say drop this rotate before the copy, this is going to change how this copy is interpreting that incoming geometry. So what we're left with is simply this. This is all that it's doing, is rotating the geometry that's going to be copied. But once we highlight the copy, you can see that it has this nice little offset to it. And you can see that it's actually chugging pretty hard right now because this is pretty heavy geo. So on my copy, I'm going to just select pack an instance, and that makes it so that it isn't, it just optimizes how it handles the geometry. So when I click playback now, it's playing back, and you can kind of see it doing its thing there, and its performance is much better. I'm going to tick the real-time toggle here just so that we can better see what's going on. You can see that there's a little bit of an offset happening. There's a little bit of fluctuation in, you know, kind of how all these clones are aligning as it's going through this animation. So I'm going to let's just modify this slightly. Let's say we want also to rotate in the Y, but in the opposite direction. So I'm going to type in -@frame so that we kind of get a little bit of motion in the Y axis as well. And you can really start to see this variation coming out in these little tunnels that we've created. Cool. So let's lastly go to our copy object, and maybe let's throw it on another transform afterwards. Let's go throw on a transform down here, and maybe we could just rotate this whole thing in Y by @frame by the frame number as well. So it has a little bit of a, it looks like it's spinning, and then it eventually gets to a point where it decides to almost look like it turns around or something like that. So that's cool. Yeah, and you can play with any of this stuff and get like cool results. You know, if I modify the rotation on the copy stamp, you can get all sorts of, you know, wildly offset behavior. Which is cool. You could even animate this if you wanted to. But for our purposes, well, let's just see what it looks like. I'm going to just put in @frame on the Y rotation. You can see that it's getting nuts pretty quickly. So, but, you know, with a little bit of experimentation, I'm just going to right click and say delete channels here. So that gets locked down. With a little bit of experimentation, you could probably stumble upon some pretty cool looks. So We're going to just go with this for right now. I just want to kind of experiment around with polywire a little bit more just to see if I can get something else. I'm going to change my filter quality to be a little bit lower and maybe change the strength of the smoothing to go up a little bit so we kind of get these sharper shapes. Let's just experiment with changing the segments. Yeah, you can get some pretty interesting segments by just changing pretty interesting variation just by changing these segments. And let's see what changing the divisions does. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm gonna go. Let's stick with something like this for right now. Yeah, I'm gonna keep this back to 0.25. Whoops. Let's delete channels. Oops, I gotta stop this in order to fix that. Let's right click, delete channels, and then type in 0.25 again here and hit enter. And let's just I'm gonna bring these divisions down. We're gonna do 5 divisions, 5 segments. If we think about this here, our geometry, it actually, we did all of these expressions are, based off of the frame. So after about 300, if they're all, kind of the same interval, if we go 360 frames, we should get a perfect loop. So I'm just going to adjust the end frame here to 360. And I just want to test the playback to see if this does seamlessly loop back to the beginning. So if I click play over here and it loops back, yeah, it's a seamless loop. Cool. Let's try that one more time. Awesome. So it just keeps going. Now that I'm watching this playing, I'm seeing it looking like I can see through it a little bit too much. And I know that I'm going to want that to be a little bit thicker. So I'm just going to increase the thickness of my wire radius so that I can't quite see through this as much. I'm going to also increase the divisions. Yeah, maybe decrease this a little bit, something like that. Just a little bit more obscured in the center to help maintain that sense of mystery. All right, so now let's start doing our rendering thing. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a camera angle that I like, something like this. Let's look down the x-axis just to make things a little bit, make more sense. I'm going to bring this up into the middle of my frame, and I'm going to control click on the camera icon up here in the shelf, and that will give us a camera based off of our current view. Now, I don't have this lock selected. Making sure that lock isn't selected, if I were to pan away now, you can see that it leaves my camera behind, and my camera is sitting there looking at my object just the way I left it. Cool. So the next thing we need is a mantra render node, and that is done in the output context. So earlier when we were talking about our different contexts, we have our rendering context, which is our output context right here. So I'm going to go in there. You can see that we don't have anything here yet. I'm just going to hit tab and type mantra. That creates a mantra node. Now, by default, if we were to go to our render view over here and click render, it would create a mantra node for us, but I'm just going about it a different way. Just showing you that you can create your nodes by hand in here by yourself. This is the render settings basically. We've got our render current frame set. If I change this to render frame range, it will render from f start to f end, which is defined by the start and end bounds of our play range that we set earlier. By default, it's going to use camera 1 to render. That's cool. We can override the camera resolution here if we wanted to. We'd set it to like half res or something like that. I'll do that for right now just to make things run a little bit faster. It looks like the resolution that it would actually be pulling, though, if I wasn't overriding, would be the resolution from the camera that we set right here. So if I use my selection tool and select that camera, in the View tab, you can see that it's going to render at 1280 by 720. You can select something like 1080 from the right-hand corner drop-down box right here. So we'll just do that. And then if I go back to, if I hit this back key, that'll go back to the last node I had selected. You can see we're just going to do half res for right now. I'll even change it just to go a little bit faster to do something like quarter res. So down here in under the images tab, we've got our little expression for where we're going to be outputting our picture to. And this is a lot like the token system in Cinema 4D, the $hip variable is going to be pointing to the location where our current project file is. So if I open up my aliases and variables, you'll see that that hip right here, if I click hip, is referring to the directory that our actual project is located. So with that in mind, we can determine that it's going to build a file path to this directory. Then it's going to build another folder inside of that directory called render. And then after that, it's going to create a file that's called hip name using this variable $hip name. Over here in aliases and variables, you can see hip name is just the name of the file that we're actually working in right now. And then it's going to say $OS. Now, $OS is an expression that refers to the node that we are currently on. So because this is this expression is written in the parameters for the mantra1 node, $OS is going to evaluate to simply the string of whatever this is right here, mantra1. Cool. Then we have another dot, and then we have $F4. $F4 just basically refers to whatever frame we're currently on, padded with 4 zeros. So if we're on frame 1, it's going to be frame 0001. If we're on frame 100, it's going to be frame 0100, and so on. So to see what this evaluates to, we can just middle mouse click on the output picture parameter over here. And you can see that it changes this string and to give you a preview of what it actually is going to evaluate to. So you can see it goes all the way out to our directory that we have for hip. Then it makes a render folder. Then it does our file, our project name, which is lesson 02E rendering version 4 .mantra1 as it's written down here, .001.exr. So if I were to change this mantra1 to say mantra render and hit enter, you can see it changes this name up here. Cool. Just going to middle mouse click on this to put it back to just put it back to the expression syntax. So cool. Now down here under output, there's a bunch of options for different stuff. Under extra image planes, you can choose to like add a depth pass if you want. So that's where all that stuff is located. Back up here on the rendering tab, under the rendering engine, you're going to want to choose the physically based rendering option. That's the one that is like sort of the standard, the standard render engine you'd want to use for doing any sort of photorealistic rendering. And then down here, we've got our sampling options. So pixel samples, pretty low, pretty basic averages, 3 and 3. I think you can go, you don't want to go like super crazy with these, but anywhere between 3 and 9 tends to get a good result for rendering in Mantra. And then you also have your fine-tuned controls. Where all these are global pixel samples, you get more fine detailed controls down here for the sampling kind of stuff. And then also over here, you get your reflection and refraction limits, so you can set all those. And then you've got some other options over here, but we're not going to really get into any of that right now. So cool. The next thing we're going to need in our scene, if I just hop back out to the object level, is we're going to need some lights. So I'm going to just going to drag my camera over to an area that I think would look cool for a rim light, something maybe like this. And I'm just going to control click area light. And that creates a light out of our view. And with making sure that lock isn't selected, if I move away, you can see that it's got a light there. Just going to grab that. Whoops. I'm going to grab this light, being careful not to accidentally select this light rotator tool. Just going to grab it along this axis and just drag it in a little bit to get it a little bit closer, and maybe bring it, maybe grab it on, move it on this Y a little bit, something like that. And we'll just add another fill light over here. I'm just going to kind of zoom into this area and control click area light again, and we'll zoom out and we can see that we've got our area light there, and let's drag that in as well. And we'll just go with that for right now and see what we're looking like. So I'm just going to take our lights that it's created over here in our network and just drag them up here so that they're sort of positioned. And then I'm going to pop over to I could pop over here to this render view, but I like actually being able to work in my scene and see what's rendering at the same time. So I'm going to, up here, I'm going to split my panes top and bottom like that. And so instead of having another scene view down here, I'm just going to right click on this tab and change it to a render view. So I've got a render view here. You can see that it's selected my Mantra render node here. And then for my camera, I'll just choose my camera 1. Cool. So let's also create a material for our object. So I'm going to go select our object here, and I'm going to, let's choose a principled shader. I'm going to just drag that right onto the object. Alternatively, you could go to your render settings right here and drag the principled shader into your, drag the principled shader you created here. So after you select this object, you could drag it up there, but it's actually not behaving correctly because it isn't pinned. So if I were to pin this view, I could, select this and drag my principled shader in there like that. Or if this is unpinned and we select this, I could select my principled shader from this pick, the object chooser right here. So let's say accept, and we got our principled shader. I'm just going to go back to the surface settings, just dial the color back to be a little bit moodier, darker gray kind of a color like that. And we'll just fire off a render and see where we're at. So zooming in, you can see that it is starting to resolve like so. I can see my fill looks like it's a little bit intense. Just going to go back to my network view and select this area light 2, which is the fill. And I'm going to rename this one the rim. And I'm going to just bring my fill light exposure back a little bit so that it is a little bit more dramatic like so. Cool. So now what we could do is let's just go into the material palette and adjust this shader a little bit. I want to crank the roughness down a little bit, but then give it some coating and take the coating roughness and keep that coating roughness pretty low. So that should be good. Nextly, what I would like to do is if I pop over here to this matte area, you can see that this is also, we've got our material palette, which is the user-friendly way of, kind of creating Mantra shaders. But in our material palette, this is, one of the contexts of Houdini. And in here, if you wanted to do something like add a texture to your shader, you could do that right here. You could type tab and say texture, and then, pipe in the color from your texture. You would go in here and you would pick a file. For example, it looks like it's got a default file chosen right here, but we could just wire the color into, oops, I'm going to close this. I'm going to spin down this surface and wire the color of this texture into the base color. And it should update our render accordingly. Like so, you can see that it has started to add the colors of this mandrel picture into our scene. I'm not really after that at this moment, so I'm just going to disconnect that by holding down Y and slicing through it with my left mouse button, and then I'll delete this texture. So back to our, back to our object context. I just want to add a little bit of environmental fog to the scene. And I'm going to do that by adding a box. So let's throw it on a box. And then in our inside the box, I'm going to crank up the scale to something like 20. So it's huge. If I zoom here and hit spacebar F, you can see that it is, and I'm also going to hit W for wireframe. You can see that this box is sort of encapsulating our whole scene here. If I add a special shader in our material palette to this geometry, it'll actually convert it to a volume at render time. So I'm going to choose uniform volume and put that in there like so. Then I'm going to hop back over to my, select this object, and under render, I'll select my uniform volume and hit accept. So now in the scene, it is rendering the volume, but it's a little bit too dense. So I'm just going to go up here to my cloud density and just turn that to something like 0.01. So it becomes very, it kind of generates like sort of a fog for your, like so. Going back, I'm just going to try and dial these settings around a little bit. I think that something that worked for me in the object context was to get my, I was moving the box around to get it put in a slightly different position. So I'm going to grab my manipulator and drag it back here a little bit. And that just sort of like brings the box sort of behind the fog a little bit, so that there's just a little bit more contrast in front. We don't have that much volume between the camera and the object that is sort of obscuring our render here. So we can kind of have some more, just some more definition up towards the front of the render. And also on our rim here, I'm just going to dial back the intensity or the exposure of it a little bit, because it seems to be a little intense for this. So something like that. Cool. Now I think just to add a little bit more ambient light to my scene, I'm going to throw down an environment. So I'm just going to click environment light from the shelf up here, and we'll just bring it over here and just kind of organize these a little bit. I'm going to select from my environment map over here in the HFS Houdini Pick HDRI folder. I'm just going to select Garage 2K. These are just default sort of HDRIs that come with Houdini. I'm just going to throw this Garage one in there and hit accept. Then I'm going to turn my render back on here. I'm getting a warning here. It's not to be worried about. That's just referring to the fact that it's trying to use displacement or something in the volume shader, and we're not working with that right now, so we don't need to deal with that. But yeah, so I added this environment. You can see that the environment is actually affecting the volume, and I don't want that to happen. So if I select this box, which I'm going to rename to fog. So we've got that labeled accordingly. Under the light mask option, if you're on the render setting tab of the fog object, under light mask, there's an asterisk here, and the asterisk means it's going to accept all the lights in the scene. If we just want to link it to one light, we can go to our chooser here and select the rim light. Just want to only have the rim light affecting our scene, or our fog. So I'm just going to select the rim light and hit accept pattern. You can see it's replaced that asterisk with the name of our light, rim. Cool. So the only other thing is this environment light is a little bit intense, so I'm just going to take it back to like a 0.2, just so we get a little bit of that ambience in the scene, but not too much. And if I go back to the fog, I'm going to just, if I've got my material here, if I just click this little arrow to the right, that will hop me into the material, and I could actually just maybe crank up the density of these clouds a little bit. So something like that. Cool. So while this is refreshing, if I'm holding my mouse button over and dragging it around, you can see it actually will optimize the area that I'm focusing on, and try to render and focus on rendering that, which is kind of handy. So if I change this value, you can do something like that. I could also shift drag select a box, and it would focus on rendering that region. And just shift clicking outside will make that box go away, and it'll start refreshing the entire scene again. Cool. I just want to bring this box back a little bit more so that we get a little bit more contrast towards the front here. And I think that I just need a little bit more energy in my rim light. So let's go back to the object level, grab the rim light, and maybe take the exposure up to something like 5. And good. So if I was going to move towards making a final render here, I'd want to check and make sure that, I was getting enough samples and there wasn't a lot of noise. So let's go back to the output context and grab our mantra node. And I'm just going to untick override camera resolution. So now we're rendering at full res here. Again, I'm just moving around my render view the same way I would move around my network view. I'm using my scroll wheel to zoom in and out, holding on the option key and using my middle mouse to pan around and stuff like that. Left mouse click, again, you can see is just helping optimize certain areas that we want to refresh and whatnot. Okay, cool. So So over here, if I click this box up here, this undoes this turns off the automatic like going over all the entire scene and refreshing it constantly. You can see that it just throws our buckets in the middle and starts spiraling outward. Again, I can be dragging this around to kind of see what the samples are doing, and if I just like check this area right here by box selecting it, you can see that we've got a lot of noise up here. So part of this can be handled in the shader. So if I go to the uniform volume shader and just crank it up to something like 16 samples, you can see a lot of that clears up right away. And then also I could go back to my my render settings, and on my mantra node, I could go down to my sampling here, and where it says stochastic samples, I could crank that up to 16. And this is sampling that is just specific to volumetrics. It's not going to change the sampling on most of the rest of the scene. It's just to kind of clean up the noise that was in that volume back there. Cool. So the next step after this, once you get your your settings dialed in, would be to kick off a batch render. So I'm just going to stop this real quick and show you how to do that. So back here on our mantra node, again, you just go to the output context and select your mantra node. We've got our render frame range going on. I'm just, for the sake of making this go faster, I'm going to turn these samples back down to something like 4, and I'm going to just render the, I'm going to override the camera resolution to something like obnoxious, like a 10th resolution, or maybe just a 5th. We'll do something like that. What I could do at this point is click render to disk, and it'll start rendering my files into that folder. So I'm going to pause the recording and do that real quick. So on my mantra node here, I'm just going to click render to disk. And you can see that it's going to give us a little pop-up here that kind of gives us some of our progress, shows us what's going on. And if I go down to, if I show my Explorer, you can see that it has created the render folder in there, and it is writing EXR files into my render directory. So it'll just go through this and render for a little bit, and then I'll check back in a couple minutes. So I'm going to just pause the recording here. Cool. So I'll let it render for a few frames here, and then I interrupted it. You can see that it's left this checkpoint lock file here. I'm just going to delete that. And let's just open up DJV view, and I'm just going to drag this one in there. You can see that it is indeed started to render our image sequence. Cool. So now let's take a look at how we can do this in Redshift. Most of us, if you're rendering out of Houdini, you're going to want to probably be using Redshift. It's what I use. It's my renderer of choice. And even if I'm taking the stuff out of Houdini and bringing it into Cinema 4D and rendering there, I'm also rendering in Redshift. So because it's a sort of a in a modern motion design pipeline, Redshift seems to be pretty standard. Or Octane. I personally haven't used Octane with Houdini, but I know there are tutorials out there for how to do some stuff with Octane in Houdini if you're interested in that. For me personally, I think that it's nice to just touch on a GPU renderer just so that we at least have that base covered in case you want to do any type of GPU rendering directly out of Houdini on your own. Now, we're not going to do like a fully comprehensive Redshift for Houdini type of exploration here. We're just going to do, a little bit of just some of the basics to get you kind of familiar. So I'm assuming that you've got at this point Houdini or a Redshift installed for Houdini, and maybe you're familiar with Redshift in other applications, but just the whole setup in Houdini is a little bit daunting to you. So we'll just go through that process right now. So I'm going to just back out to my object level here, and I'm going to disable these lights by selecting them, and then going up to the light tab, and then here where it says like under, it'll either say under, like if I select one of my area lights, I'll have either the enable checkbox here, I can enable that, I can disable it, And then on the environment light, there's another, the light enabled is actually down here. So I'm just going to disable that. So now if I render my scene, I should be able to see, I shouldn't have any, it should just go back to the default light. And it has. So we've removed our lighting from the scene that is a mantra related lighting. So that's cool. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a redshift ROP. So a ROP is, referring to this output context here. A ROP is a render operator. And to get that, I'm going to actually go to my redshift shelf up here. Now, if this redshift shelf doesn't appear for you, it's going to remove it from my shelf real quick. If your redshift shelf doesn't appear in Houdini, you just click this plus icon and then go to shelves and then scroll all the way down to here where there is the, there it is, the redshift shelf. So that brings up a bunch of handy little tools right here. And what we want is to create a redshift ROP. So we just click this. And here we are. We've got our redshift ROP and then our IPR ROP. So IPR ROP just kind of sits there. Most of the work, relevant settings are on this redshift ROP node right here. So I'm going to, let's just go over this real quick. This is very similar to the mantra render. We've got our camera selection here. We've got our frame range. We can render a frame range if we want. We've got our output that this output tab will tell us where it's going to be writing our files. It actually uses the same exact naming convention as the mantra render, except here it's going to be taking $OS from the redshift ROP. So you can see our file name has changed. So we're not accidentally going to overwrite our mantra renders just because this expression is identical. So the rest of your redshift settings are kind of the same standard tabs here. You've got your sampling settings, motion blur. You can select your trace depths, global illumination. I'm just going to turn that on right now to brute force, and 3 GI bounces. That's sort of just how I kind of like to get things started. And yeah, other than that, here you can turn on your environment if you want to have volumetric scattering. I'm going to actually use the box that we created earlier and just kind of show how to get it going with that. So yeah, let's go back up to our object level and let's make our lights. So I'm going to hide these lights as well. Turning off the visibility flag on these lights will hide them from the viewport, but you still do have to, disable them using that checkbox. It's kind of annoying, but it's just something you kind of got to deal with. So now down here, we could very well use the same render view, but Redshift has its own render view, and I kind of like to use it a little bit more. So I'm going to just add a new tab down here. In new tab type, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and there's the Redshift render view. And it's very similar, but it's slightly different. So we've got that available. And if I were to click this play icon, and it is rendering, but it doesn't see anything because I'm pretty sure it doesn't know what to do with the material that's on there, it being a mantra material. So let's go make our first Redshift material. So we can't really do that, as far as I know, from the material palette. The way it's done is over here in the matte context. So inside the matte context, you can see we've got our shaders. We could be where we would normally, like add textures and stuff. In here, the way I create Redshift material is I will hit tab and type down RS Material Builder. So this RS Material Builder, if I hit enter, it throws this down, and it is a Redshift VOPNet. I'm just going to call this my my geo. Let's see, my geo material, because we're going to create another one for volumetric material later. But so here's our material for our geo. I'm going to just hop inside there, and you can see that this is very similar to the Redshift shader graph in Cinema 4D. We've got our outputs here for our surface and our volume, displacement, all that stuff, but nothing is hooked up to it. So we need to create a Redshift material. Kind of confusing because we just created a Redshift material builder, but then inside of that, we're actually creating our Redshift material and then wiring the color into the surface. So here now we've got our all your normal custom presets. We can make like aluminum or glass or whatever. I'm just gonna dial our color back to some dark gray value like we had before. I'm going to add just a little bit of roughness to our reflections, and then in our coding, I'm going to take the coding weight all the way up and leave the roughness to 0. So let's just kick off a render of that and see where we're at. And it looks like still I'm not seeing anything happening. So let's go back over. Oh, you know what it is? I haven't really assigned it to our object yet. So if I go back to our object level and grab our geo, I'm going to, from our picker here, choose the geo material that we created. So let's click accept. Yeah, it's probably because it doesn't know what to do with this fog object. I'm just going to turn the fog object off for a second and fire off another render. I'm going to look through my camera real quick, like so. And I mean, just for the sake of trying to figure things out, let's throw down a light similar to how we did before. So up here, I'm going to rotate my camera into position and control click on RS light to create a light. And you can see it makes my little light over here. I'm just going to lock that and slide into position here. And then maybe just for the sake of seeing if we can get anything to show up, I'm going to crank it up. I'm going to crank the intensity of the light up super high. So under the shader, I'm just going to crank the intensity to like 4,000 or something. All right, cool. We can start to see things showing up. Probably my scene just needed to have a light in it. Honestly, I think that's probably what the issue was. So with my light locked, I'm going to just kind of drag this around until I get into an area that I'm happy with how it's affecting the lighting on this object. So that's cool. And then what I'll do is I'm going to unlock my camera so I can move around, and I'm going to just move over here so I can create my rim light similar to how we did in our mantra section. And I'm going to control click the RS light again to create that right there. Just going to hit the lock key, the lock button, and drag in on that so we start to get some stuff showing up here. On the side, we've got some like highlights, etc. Okay, cool. So I've got these two lights. Then I want to add a redshift. Let's add a dome light. So throw down a redshift light dome, and by default that comes in white. I'm going to stop the recording or the rendering real quick, and I'm going to jump into the light dome, go to the shader, and just select a dome map. This won't load the default, these .rat files. They don't seem to work. So I'm just going to go to my, my personal collection and grab any old HDRI just to add some reflections to my scene and just a little bit of ambient light. So let's go to, I'm just going to go here. Just bear with me for a second. All right. So I've got my, my HDRI in here, and I'm just going to fire my render back off, see what that does for things in here. Cool. I don't actually want this to be visible in the background, so I'm going to on my light dome, I'm going to untick enable background, and let's maybe just rotate it around a little bit. Shader, transform. I'm going to just rotate it. See if I can't get any interesting type reflections on my material. Yeah, something like that looks pretty cool. Now let's just deal with our fog. So we could on our main node, or on our main redshift node, we could add volumetric scattering here, and then go back to our light and add some volume contribution under the light tab down here. You can see that we're adding some fog. I'm just gonna I'm gonna leave this contribution on, but I want to actually add the fog using the using this fog object that we had created. So going back to the output, selecting our redshift ROP and volumetric scattering, I'm going to turn that off. Then I'm going to go back out to our object level, and then let's turn on our fog. Now our fog isn't going to really work the same way. It's just there isn't a shader in Redshift that turns a piece of geo into a fog, so we're going to kind of have to do that on our own. So I'm going to just delete this material out of this slot right here, and I'm going to dive into the fog object, and I'm just going to convert this into a fog using a volume object. So I'm going to hit tab and type in volume and wire this into the top and hit the display flag here. And what this basically does is it takes the shape of the object and makes a volume out of it. I'm just going to turn up the sampling divisions so it's a little bit higher res. You know, it'll be 50 divisions of voxels along each axis. And then I'm going to change the name to density. So we're just going to create a density field. And the default value is going to be 1, 1, and 1. So now I just need to create a fog shader. So I'm going to go back over to my matte context here and create another Redshift material builder. And I'm going to call this volume. So if I dive inside, I'll create a new node called RS volume. And instead of wiring this into my surface output, I'm going to wire this into my volume. So here it's going to be using the density channel to create our volume shader. So let's just turn the renderer back on. And everything is super dark. If I turn up this scattering, and maybe in the advanced tab, I'll turn down the maximum density to 0.01. Something like that. Not seeing anything showing up. Let's go back to our volume shader into the basic tab and then turn down the absorption coefficient. And nothing's happening there. Let's see. Oh, I need to assign it to my object again. Let's go back out to the object level. And on our fog, we'll assign our volume. I'm just going to turn this off and refresh it. There, you can see we've got sort of this atmospheric fog kind of showing up here, which is kind of cool. I'm just going to go back to the shader real quick and dial that around a little bit. So if I actually go to my material palette, you can see it is populating those volumes that we created, or those materials that we created. So let's go over here, and it doesn't really give us very many options to mess with it. So I'm just going to double click and to jump back to our matte context. And here we are in our volume. I'm going to dive inside, go back to our volume shader, and I can just crank up the scatter coefficient. I'm going to maybe try and bring this maximum density up a little bit so we kind of get some of these rays appearing here, which is kind of cool. And then maybe our absorption can come, let's bring our absorption somewhere like that. That looks pretty cool. Then I just click this little box, and then it starts rendering. It just starts rendering the scene as it would with our render settings on our Redshift ROP. If I go back to our output context, I just want to increase the settings a little bit so that we don't have so much noise. So if I go up here and kind of, shift select similarly, I can see that I've got a lot of noise in my fog. I'm just going to go back to my Redshift tab, settings, and then my sampling options, and just crank this up to something like 256 for the max samples and maybe 16 for the minimum samples. You can see that that is already starting to look a lot better. And we're rendering at, I think we're rendering at full res already. But if I go and just if I go to, I like to go to fixed scaling over here and then set this to 100. That kind of brings us back to, that homes us in on where we're zoomed in at. And you can just see kind of how things are going here. That's looking pretty cool. I think right now what I would do is I would just call this good and fire off a little low res sample of it, just like we did with the other render. So I'm just going to do that real quick. So if I go over to the main tab on our Redshift ROP in our output context, I'm going to just override the camera resolution. We'll do quarter res for right now. We're rendering a frame range of 1 to 360. That's cool. Over here, it's going to go into this render folder. I'm going to just put it in its own Redshift render folder called rs_render. That way it's going to kind of stay separate from the files that we created for the other rendering. So if I go back to, I'm just going to pull up the lesson real quick. So over here, this is where we rendered our previous frames for Mantra. It's going to create a new folder in E for us that should be rs_render now that we did that. Cool. So I'm just going to hide that real quick, and let's just hit the render to disk button right here. A cool thing that I like about Redshift versus Mantra is that it also renders to mplay while writing files out to disk. This is a lot. This behavior is very similar to how Picture Viewer and Cinema 4D works. It actually gives you visual feedback as to what you're rendering while you're rendering it. So I'm going to hit render to disk, and it's going to think about it for a second. And this Redshift ROP, this progress bar appears, and then our mplay starts to appear. And if we zoom in on that, you can see that it is rendering out our image here. Now, if I open up our Explorer here, you can see it is creating, it has created the RS render folder, and it is dropping images into it. And then we receive an error. What happened here? So it looks like there's a flag here. This is having an issue with the other HDRI that's in the scene. So I'm just gonna hop back out to the object level, and I'm just gonna delete these other lights that we had in our scene and see if that fixes it. Just go back to our output context here, and then click render to disk. See, it doesn't have a problem with rendering the first frame. That's good. It's appearing in our file explorer. I usually don't have projects that mix Mantra and Redshift within the same project usually, so I rarely will run into issues like this. But so cool. It looks like that actually worked. It's moved on to the next frame, and it's just clipping through here, writing out our EXR files and writing to disk, and we're good to go. So that was sort of an overview of how to render a simple scene using some of the features of Redshift in Houdini and some of the features of Mantra in Houdini. And going forward from here, we're probably going to do most of our projects. We're going to explore our projects and then kind of work with exporting them into Cinema 4D. But just so that you have a primer for your gateway into rendering in Houdini, this is sort of your primer. This is sort of the crux of it, the meat and potatoes, if you will. And so if you need to do your rendering in Houdini, you've come to the right spot. You came, you conquered, you saw.